Okay, I'm hitting start. Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to Hot Topics in M&A, Data Privacy and Cybersecurity. This discussion has been organized by the DAYL Deal Bootcamp Committee. This is the third in a three-part discussion series this year, tailored for Deal Bootcamp and refining the skills of our younger transactional attorneys. We thank them for their hard work throughout this year. If you are interested in joining this committee next year, please reach out to Sherry Harris or to myself after this panel. A couple of housekeeping matters at the top of this presentation. This discussion has been approved for 1 hour of CLE credit, which you will need to self-report. The course credit number that you will need for self-reporting is in the Zoom chat. It will be put in the Zoom chat again at the end of the hour. If you have questions during this panel, which we encourage, please use the Q&A function in Zoom rather than the chat feature, and we will answer them as best we can and as time allows. And as always with these CLE panels, the views of our panelists are their own personal views, do not reflect those of their companies. This is for informational purposes only. My name is Kristen Knopf. I am an in-house attorney with the American Heart Association, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's discussion panel and introducing our wonderful panelists. Going from left to right on my screen I start with Kate Morris, a technology and privacy attorney and co-founder of the firm Hush and Morris here in Dallas. Rachel Berlage, a corporate counsel for corporate external and legal affairs with Microsoft. And Michael Andrews, associate general counsel for ECI Software Solutions. M&A is having a bit of a moment right now with low interest rates, an abundance of private equity, and a rising stock market. Also having a bit of a moment right now is data privacy and cybersecurity, with dozens of headlines in the news every day, whether it's the collection of personal information by the latest technology gadgets or social media apps, yet another data breach at a Fortune 500 company, or sharing public health data that may help bring an end to the COVID-19 pandemic once and for all. Deal attorneys may not necessarily be keeping up to date 100% on the evolving universe of consumer data privacy rules and regulations. But the fact of the matter is that this web of rules and regulations can create many issues that could significantly impact the value of your deal. Our hope today is to give you a working vocabulary of the types of issues for you to spot in your next transaction so that you can be the one adding value to that deal. Kate, I'll start with you to kick it off our discussion today. Could you please give us a really high-level overview of not only the universe of data privacy laws, state, federal, industry, international, and I do emphasize brief because we could spend the entire hour talking about those as well. But also, I like everything else in the last 18 months, M&A has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I would be interested to hear not only an overview of these data privacy rules and regulations so that we're all on the same page, but big trends and hot topics in that M&A space as well.
Thanks, Kristen. I'd love to. So let's talk about big picture M&A trends right now. We are in a night and day situation from where we were last year. The first half of 2021 was the most active M&A half ever, with approximately $3 trillion in deal volume. And anecdotally, I'll just tell you this deal momentum has carried into Q3. As compared to past peak times where M&A volume has been driven by the big mega deals, the volume now is being driven by transactions impacting the middle market. 9 of the 20 biggest transactions have been in the technology sector. And indeed, that's understandable because COVID has really driven a lot of technological change. So another trend is that private equity and corporates are really competing like never before. Private equity is paying high teen multiples for quality assets. Why is that? Well, it's what you said, Kristen, earlier. There's so much cheap capital that's available, and it's adding phenomenal amounts of liquidity and depth to the M&A market. So let's talk about what these trends mean for privacy and cybersecurity and M&A. And this is my personal opinion. I think 3 things. First, I think the aggressive pace of these deals has often not allowed for meaningful privacy and cybersecurity review. Many M&A lawyers are just trying to get the deals done on a pace that the client demands, and they've not comprehensively counseled their clients regarding especially the reps and warranties in and around privacy and cyber. Then those who have counseled their clients often have met resistance. That's problematic. And I think it likely stems from a misunderstanding that data governance is a matter of compliance rather than an operational competitive advantage for these companies, which, like you said, Kristen, is a value add. Second, the problems generally have been compounded by this current environment that targets middle market companies. Typically, middle market companies are less sophisticated in their privacy and cyber postures. They may not have a chief privacy officer. They may not have a chief information security officer. They may not have formal written privacy programs, written information security programs, regular training for their workforces. They might not have privacy and cyber incorporated into their procurement process. They might not have data maps. Their boards might not monitor privacy and cyber, yet all of those things are required under various laws. Third, it's indisputable that data is an asset, but without reasonable privacy and cybersecurity controls, it's also a liability. And I want you all to remember that Verizon cut the valuation of Yahoo in its acquisition by $350 million when they discovered a data breach during that whole deal. In 2019, similarly, ICO, which is the UK Information Commissioner's Office, fined Marriott over $120 million because they, in their acquisition of Starwood, there was a discovery of a data breach. So these are real issues. And if we could go to the first slide, let's really talk about how to spot the issues, and we'll do this quickly. But what we're doing is we are focusing in privacy on personal information. And what personal information is it's any information that relates to an identifiable person. Now, what you need to recognize is that in the olden days, we were all worried about social security numbers. It's changed. Privacy laws have expanded the definition of personal information. For example, the California Consumer Privacy Act includes geolocation data, device information like IP addresses, audio, electronic, visual, olfactory information, information about your gait, how you walk. All of that is considered personal information, and it's regulated. And so who has to comply with that? It's not just the organizations that collect the information directly from the consumers or their employees. It's also anyone that processes that information on behalf of those organizations. So it's basically everyone. What law controls? Well, it depends. It's changing every day because of how so many of these laws are claiming to have extraterritorial effects. What of cybersecurity amidst all of this? Cybersecurity and privacy are distinct, but you can't have privacy without cybersecurity. And so it's critical to the entire picture of securing personal information. And then how does privacy generally relate to M&A deals? Personal information is part of a company's data. It has value. It's your customer list. It's your employee information. It's, who's providing different services. All of these things have value and they can create liability. So let's go to the next slide and just kind of survey laws quickly. And what I've done is I've just posted a sampling, a smidge, to give you all a good overview. But look at the United States, and what you'll notice is we have a sectoral approach to privacy. We don't have a comprehensive national privacy law. Instead, we're regulating certain types of information, whether that's consumer information regulated by the FTC, financial information, health information, children's information. Your risk disclosures, the SEC could regulate. If you're in telecom, you have other regulators that you answer to. Same with energy, same with all kind of information sharing. On the state level, though, we're starting to see comprehensive privacy laws. Think California, Virginia, and Colorado now have comprehensive laws. We have these breach notification laws. Those are expanding and they're having cybersecurity requirements incorporated into them. Biometric information, your fingerprints, your iris scans, your facial geometry, hot area, you guys. Facebook was fined $550 million for violating the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act. Now they're shutting down their facial recognition system. That's news of last week because of this kind of liability. Then you have industry standards and things that your company may ascribe to if they're processing payment card information, PCI, depending on what security certifications they're working on. You have NIST, ISO, and other regimes, OWASP and things. And then internationally, Europe is the hotspot. A lot of middle market companies who aren't exposed to Europe are behind. The ones who are typically have been trying to comply with the GDPR, which is probably the most comprehensive privacy law out there now. But other countries are following the Europeans' template. And so this is becoming an issue internationally. And we'll go to the last slide, and then I'm going to let Rachel take over. Rather than getting into the weeds about what the obligations are under each of these laws, think about these guiding principles. What you need to think about is accurately representing your privacy practices. That means knowing what you do with data, where it goes, how it's shared and used, and putting that in a privacy notice. You have to use it only for the purposes that you tell people you're going to use it for. That issue comes up often in M&A because the acquiring company may have other ideas in mind. In your privacy notice, you also better say how you're transferring data. Is it going to be transferred to someone who's looking to acquire you? It should say that in the privacy notice if that's the case. Keeping data minimized, not collecting more than you need, making sure it's accurate, not keeping it for longer than you need, and then having the data security and cybersecurity in and around that data to ensure that it remains confidential. Finally, keep in mind that it is not the jurisdiction that you are headquartered in whose law controls. Most of the time, it is the jurisdiction where the people, the data subjects whose personal information you are collecting, where they are located or where you're regulated. You may be answering to multiple regulators, and it's important to identify the types of data that you have, where the data subjects are, and what laws apply in order to fully assess your obligations and potential liabilities. I'll turn it back to you, Kristen.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you. That was very helpful and gives us a good primer and an overview on why these are issues that everyone in the mergers and acquisition space on both sides of the deal should be paying attention to these rules and regulations. So why don't we start on the sell side? Because the statistics that you mentioned a moment ago with regard to just exactly how big of a moment M&A is having right now, there could be those that are very interested in all of a sudden selling and getting the most for their assets, their companies at the moment. So what are some things to think about as we're preparing to, if we have our company, if our got a company and it's got some customer data, it's perhaps not in one of these hot sectoral areas, but average, M&A transaction, if we're preparing on the sell side, perhaps over and above what we would normally think in preparing for a deal, what special considerations should we think about? And I will start with you, Rachel.
Sure. I think I'd like to start with a little bit of advice that applies not just to data privacy, but just kind of preparations for sell-side M&A in general. You as a M&A corporate generalist might be dealing with clients potentially who are new to the M&A process and have never gone through an exercise like diligence before, which can be an ordeal. The clients you're working for now have responsibilities for a big transaction that's going to be transformational for their company, which is great. But don't forget, they also have their day jobs to do throughout this whole process. So it can be a lot for them, and a little bit of hand-holding, I think, can get to the best results. At the outset, I think it's important to prepare the client for each step as you come to it, from populating a data room which we'll talk about in a second, negotiating NDAs, starting to put together transaction documents, negotiating, coming up with your reps and warranties, and then negotiating them. It's important for your client to be eyes wide open on that whole process and not be surprised and unprepared. Maybe they could start down a path of doing diligence and say, well, I found everything material and I've done enough. But it's like, no, as we go along, you're going to need to take a more critical look at the information that you need to put the transaction documents together. For example, as reps and warranties that get negotiated become expanded and less favorable to the seller, the buyer will have asked for additional scope of diligence and so on. So Kristen, if you could put up the slide with a sample of diligence requests. Okay. So the first thing that you'll do is help your client set up and populate a data room. You'll likely have access to a standard diligence request list, but especially in the context of data privacy and security, you want to consider your client's industry and other particulars to the transaction. What kind of data, to Kate's point, do they have access to is relevant to their business as part of the asset portfolio. And you'll use that request list to help the client start to gather relevant information and documents. Another thing that's important to consider as you're starting to gather information, put this list together, is helping your client consider the relative sensitivities of each of these pieces of information. Particularly if you're talking about an auction process, you wouldn't want every single participant to see all of the things on this list by any means. But by way of example, your client is probably comfortable sharing copies of privacy policies with interested parties because those are already posted publicly anyway. But they would not probably want to share details about a breach or security incident with anyone but the most serious buyers. If you are a corporate generalist like I was, it's never too early to involve a data privacy specialist, especially if these issues are important to your transaction, because data is part of an important part of the asset portfolio that would be acquired, or for whatever other reason. And as Kate covered really well, this area is evolving so quickly that I don't think you can assume that a checklist that worked, even last year has everything that you need to know now. I know, Kate, you walk your clients through a really good security or privacy and security assessment. Could you talk about what that entails a little bit?
Yeah, I have to quote my law partner here, and he says things like, we can deal with bad facts, but what we can't deal with are surprises. And what these assessments do when you have a comprehensive privacy assessment or security assessment, it identifies the gaps in your organization, and then it categorizes them and prioritizes them for remediation. I really think it's important to not be surprised, to have an idea of where you guys are falling short, as a company, and start kind of fixing the most critical things, because the standard for all of these kind of privacy laws is, are you making reasonable efforts to secure the data? Are you, to basically, if you're not trying to improve, trying to secure information, trying to accurately reflect your privacy practice, you don't have a leg to stand on. And the reality is, if you don't go through the assessment process, it's more than likely that someone else is going to come in and run one buy-side assessment for you, and then you will be surprised. Then the deal might tank, then that information is out publicly, and it would be better to kind of know what you're facing before. I just will add here, back to Marriott's example, that according to ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, its investigation found that Marriott failed to undertake sufficient due diligence when it bought Starwood and should have done more to secure its systems. And later, the Information Commissioner, Elizabeth Denham at the time, said, organizations must be accountable for the personal data they hold. This can include carrying out proper due diligence when making a corporate acquisition and putting in place proper accountability measures to assess not only what personal data has been acquired, but also how it's protected. And to what Rachel said earlier, with working with the team, often this is a matter of identifying the right stakeholders. Who in the organization has ownership of privacy and security? And if the answer is no one, you identified a gap that needs to be filled before you kind of undertake this process.
Yeah, let me jump in here real quick. As coming from primarily the buy side, this is all lines up with some of the information that we were requesting. And to be honest, from being involved in a corporation, we grow primarily by acquisition, so we do a lot of these, and we have a fairly robust request list that includes all these things, and we even dive a little bit deeper in terms of our requests into tell us how your source code is controlled, tell us how you control corporate financial information, customer information, tell us if any breaches that would any known or suspected breach that would compromise access to any of those. We asked about data backups, policies around that. We asked for broad descriptions of GDPR compliance, broad descriptions with respect to data privacy requirements. It's very, very expansive. And we try to get as much information as we possibly can. So I think you're going to see some of this interaction from what we like to see on the buy side, because naturally a lot of times it conflicts with what's on the sell side. The buy side says, give me as much information as you possibly can, give me some really broad disclosures. And Kate and Rachel are right on point that you don't necessarily just want to open up your corporate warehouse to a potential buyer unless they're really serious. And even then, you want to be really careful about how you're controlling your own information in connection with that, because of all the trips and wires that are associated with it. So I just wanted to pop in with that from a little bit anecdotal.
Yeah, that leads perfectly into the last couple of topics I wanted to cover in diligence, which is, of course, before you share any information with any interested parties, you want to make sure you've negotiated and executed NDAs. Make sure all information is shared through a data room and that clients are taking advantage of the security features that offers you, like watermarks and limited sharing rights for those that are going to be looking at these documents, because they are extremely sensitive. And another reason why this is important is because there are potential risks inherent in doing cyber diligence itself, a potential opportunity for a security incident in its own right, because you have large amounts of a company's most sensitive information being shared with attorneys, bankers, third parties. I can't even couldn't even begin to list them all. And everyone's working very quickly to get this deal done. So as a seller, you're really trusting whatever cyber diligence vendor you choose with, some crown jewels and incredibly sensitive information. So, keep that in mind, diligence options, and select a reputable provider, and, follow best practices in terms of keeping your information secure.
So that's a lot. That's great. No, but this is great. And so as we move toward, we're getting the data room set up, we've got our NDAs in place, and we're talking about data compliance assessments and making sure that we're not sharing too much before we're ready to share about this. Could you talk a little bit about perhaps the types of representations and warranties? Because this, as many attorneys know, is where the heart of the matter is. How we craft these representations and warranties can really make or break a deal, and can really determine whether there's problems down the road after the fact. And then perhaps a little bit on some of the risks of perhaps over disclosing, not just during the diligence phase, but then perhaps down the road, because this is an area that, given the subject matter with data incidents and data maps and data classifications, and how that data is stored and used and collected across the company, it seems like this would be an area that's ripe for, if we're going through this too quickly, like Kate had mentioned at the start of this, or just not being aware of this could really be an area that's ripe with landmines if these reps and warranties are not crafted very carefully and very intentionally.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. I'll start with the buy side, and I'll let Kate and Rachel kind of counter this for advice on the sell side. I know from our perspective, obviously as the buyer, when we're assessing a company, we want extremely broad representations that are going to comprehensively address all or as much of the compliance with data privacy laws as we possibly can capture in very broad, expansive language. We're also wanting to capture whether or not customers have had any data breaches. I mean, that's another big one for us as well. So, broad compliance with laws, broad compliance with data privacy, whether or not there's been any security breaches, whether or not they collect customer information, what type of information do you collect? And, a lot of these times, I think, we try to exclude, and we'll talk about this maybe a little bit later too, but we'll try to exclude any qualifiers like a knowledge qualifier, right? To the company's knowledge, none of this happened, or to the company's knowledge, they've complied with all these laws. To the company's knowledge, there's been no breach. And so there's always going to be a battle around knowledge qualifiers when it comes to these reps. And from our perspective, we try to eliminate those as much as we can. We want them to make a broad outright rep that says either you've done it or you haven't, one or the other. And to the extent there's a knowledge qualifier in there and that's negotiated, then we start to look at the definition of knowledge. Okay, is this the actual knowledge? As in this specific person or these particular individuals on the sell side company, someone told them, they knew that something happened. Or can you make that a little bit, and that's a very narrow definition. From our perspective, we want that to be broader, right? You want actual knowledge or constructive knowledge. And you can even dive further into dissecting what constructive knowledge is. There's a host and a plethora of articles out there around what constructive knowledge actually means in the different layers there. But the concept being, if you were a CEO of a company or if you were a CIO of a company, even if you didn't have actual knowledge, if you were being reasonable in your role, should you have known that something was going to happen? And of course, that really expands the scope of what can flow into that representation through that knowledge qualifier. Because even if you didn't really know that something happened, but if someone can make a valid argument that if you were following industry standard procedures, that you would have known that there would have been some sort of breach, then you're on the hook for it. So, again, you can really start to dive into these reps and carve them out and, go all around how you can broaden them or narrow them depending on whether you're representing the buy side or the sell side. But from the buyer's perspective, obviously, we want very broad language, no qualifiers at all. It's an outright representation. And we want to be as expansive as we possibly can with the language and the areas that we're covering in that representation.
So I'm glad that you jumped in, Michael. Perhaps before we go on to reps and warranties, because there's a lot to talk about from both sides there, are there other considerations from the buy side with respect to cybersecurity and data privacy that we should be careful in thinking about going forward in our next M&A deal?
So I would just say, yes, an NDA is not a standard NDA. You really have to think it through, because the way you share information needs to be clear when you're sharing personal information. I have seen deals where there was never a privacy notice, where a lot of personal information is transferred to the new company. They have zero right to that information. And this happens regularly. The privacy notice, where if you are intending to move data to another company, needs to say, in connection with the merger, we may share the information. So that's something you do in preparation before you put your company up for sale. You make sure your privacy notices authorize that transfer of data, that sharing of data. So from a data perspective, that's important. Also, from a data perspective, there are a lot of requirements in and around limiting access to data. We talked about data minimization briefly. We talked about storage limitations. NDAs should have temporal limitations. Access to the data should be terminated at some point. And there's, frankly, you have to think about kind of controls within your data room environment to prevent data from being exfiltrated in ways that you don't anticipate. That data should be confined to the data room. Access to it should be limited. It should be password with multi-factor authentication. You should have a schedule of people who are authorized to have access to it, because that's part of your documentation. And that's part of being reasonable, especially with your sensitive corporate information, including personal information. So they're just things to think through.
Thanks for that, Kate. That's definitely helpful to think about when we're crafting NDAs with regard to this. Michael, did you have anything else you wanted to add with regard to the buy side before we dig a little deeper into the reps and warranties and other protection mechanisms as we move forward down the M&A path?
No, not necessarily. I mean, because from the buy side, you're going into a transaction based on largely blind. So I mean, it's very different. It's a very different assessment than on the sell side, right? You know where all the skeletons are in the closet, presumably, right? If you're on the sell side. On the buy side, you see an attractive target and you're walking in thinking, okay, I just need to figure out everything that I can about this company. And I think Kate may have mentioned earlier that it's not just compliance with laws that you're worried about. You're also buying all this customer data, right? So that data in and of itself is an asset. So you've kind of got two components here when you're looking at valuation and how you want to evaluate a target company. You have this bucket of liabilities that are connected with compliance with existing security laws. So you're trying to figure out, was there a data breach? Was there some sort of situation where customer data was exposed? Is there a potential regulatory enforcement action due to a failure to comply with either GDPR or some of these other regulatory codes that are coming out in California and Virginia and Colorado and some of these other places? But even aside from the liabilities bucket, you're still looking at the assets that you're purchasing from this target company, which are generally going to include customer data, right? And so, a lot of times we look at, there's been a primary focus on intellectual property rights. So if you buy a company for a tech play, you want to see, do they own all the intellectual property associated with the software that you're buying, so on and so forth. And I think, buyers should also pay particular attention to the data that they're acquiring as well, because that is also an asset that you have to trace the right to use or the right to leverage it. I mean, you're not going to own customers' data, right? The customer's data belongs to the customer. But generally speaking, you want the right to use it, you want the right to transfer it, you want the license to do what you want to do, whatever that is, as the buyer. And so when you're looking at each of those factors, liability and assets, if there's compromise in either of those two places, you're going to want to address it in some way, shape, or form, whether that's through protectionary provisions in the purchase agreement itself, or if it's serious enough, you may need to go back to the target and say, hey, we valued you initially at X percentage of, X times EBITDA or whatever valuation metric that you're using, and saying, based on the assessment we've done, we don't think that you own what you say you own, or we think that you have this certain type of exposure from a liability perspective, and we have to address it some way. So we may need to bring the purchase price down. We may need to reallocate the risk. There are a couple of different mechanisms that you can take on that. But the general concept is, to back up again to answer your question, Kristen, is, go in and learn as much as you can about where the company currently sits with respect to its liabilities in regard to cybersecurity and its data authorization, and what other assets actually look like in connection with the valuation that you're giving them from a purchase price and a business perspective. So a lot of discovery there to be had.
That's great. That's very informative. We have a question, and I just want to remind everybody, if you have questions that come in throughout the discussion, please pop them in the Q&A feature here in Zoom. I think that this one ties nicely into what we've talked about before with the due diligence, before we get into crafting the representations and the warranties and protection mechanisms as well. So I'd like to take time to ask the panel this question before we move on. We talked about sellers knowing all of the data issues in their business. However, some sellers don't even have a working vocabulary on these issues. So does the panel have recommendations for getting at these issues as a seller legal counsel before they become an issue in the diligence process for your client? So the old, you don't know what you don't know. So how do we get the client to figure it out?
So let me jump in real quick, and then I'll kick it over to Kate and Rachel on the sell side, because I know they're going to have some comments here. But just real quick, because it's something that I already mentioned, you're thinking about the seller doesn't know what they don't know, right? So if you're talking about protectionary provisions, that goes straight to that knowledge qualifier, the definition of it, right? So you get all these broad reps that come in from the buy side counsel and the purchase agreement say, you have complied with this and you own this and there's no claims here, so on and so forth. On the sell side, like you said, you may have some unsophisticated sellers that don't really know. So to that extent, as a sell side counsel, I would, if I was on doing a lot of sell side deals, I haven't done a ton, mostly on the buy side, but my advice to my client would be, okay, tell me what you know. What do you know about? And they'll tell me what they know and say, okay, let's drop knowledge qualifiers in to cover these particular reps. And then not only are we going to drop the knowledge qualifiers in, we're going to make it actual knowledge, and we're going to stick with that. And so what you have told me is the only thing that you're going to represent to. And to the extent that the buy side wants to expand it beyond that, we're going to fight really, really hard to keep those representations qualified and the definition of knowledge extremely narrow to represent what your actual knowledge is with respect to your company. So that's my 2 cents. I'll kick it over to Kate and Rachel to add anything to that.
I'm going to jump in here because I actually would like to pretend like you're my client, and I'd like to counsel you here. Now, Michael is an M&A lawyer, so I am not. I'm a privacy lawyer, and this is a difference of perspective. M&A in general is very much focused on how can we make these documents, allocate risk in a way that's sensible for this deal. How do we value this company? And what I would say is privacy adds a couple dimensions because of its unique kind of regulatory environment. It is not just about the parties to the deal. You are going to have regulators come in. You may have class actions brought by data subjects, the people whose information you have. It's a unique unique dimension. Now, it's a cowboy world. We don't know, like, because there has not been a lot of actions in this area, how these things are going to fly. But what I would say to a company who's saying, you don't know the questions to ask, this is what we see. We see private equity portfolio companies, and their private equity parent will hire some big bad New York firm who puts a bunch of low level associates on it that then start communicating with the client saying, can we make this rep? And it will say compliance with all privacy laws in all applicable jurisdictions and blah, blah, blah. And the client is like, can we do that? And I'm like, no, you can't do that. I mean, we've been working through issues. We're not even close to being here. And so then the client has to go internally, and kind of build consensus within the C-suite, because the reality is they're not going to hire a chief privacy officer. They don't have the budget for a chief information security officer. But what they may be able to do is get an outsourced CISO, chief information security officer, to come in and do an evaluation, work with a consulting company and maybe a lawyer to try to get privilege around whatever they're doing, and get an idea of where they stand, get an idea of the critical items, fix the most critical, and then disclose the risk. Because I will say, in the privacy world, transparency really is required. I don't think you can hide the ball in these deals. You're going to be found out, whether it's by your counterparty or by a regulator or by a data subject who all of a sudden is getting notices from a new company and saying, who's this company? I have no relationship with them. No one ever told me they were going to transfer my data. And so it's just a different world, but we don't know how it's going to shake out yet. But you have to have that conversation. And you also have to tell your clients who are getting advice from these big firms and from low-level lawyers who are asking them, can we make this representation and warranty? You have to say, why aren't they counseling you? Right? Why aren't they counseling you on this? Because you need more help. Like Rachel said earlier, bring in the privacy law specialist if that's what you need, if you sense that there's that gap. This area is just too nuanced. And, even for me, like just as an example, if it involves protected health information under HIPAA, you need a privacy health lawyer, like a health privacy lawyer. It's that specialized because the regulations are so nuanced, constantly changing. And even private equity has like health deal acquisitions teams which focus in that area. So if you don't do it, you're going to get found out. And so it's something to prioritize, but it really is a matter of counseling your clients that there are these outsourced options that are available, recommending to them that, they find someone who's really knowledgeable who can handhold them through the process. And also pushing back on the firms that are saying, confirm this. Say, okay, listen, do we need to modify our engagement letter? You're not just representing me in M&A. I need you to represent me in privacy in connection with this deal too. Suddenly, a bunch of new people appear to help you. The resources are there. You just have to know to ask for them.
That's a good point on distinguishing between what hat is counsel wearing. Are they your deal counsel hat or are they your privacy counsel hat? Or is it both?
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think Kate makes a really good point here, distinguishing between, and I would say, Kate, tell me if I'm miscommunicating what you're saying here. But it's almost the concept is that before you even really get to the point where you're negotiating the reps and warranties, you want to do an internal assessment to say, where do I stand on the data privacy side? Let's fix all the things that we can fix. Because there are those regulatory agencies out there that will come after you for enforcement actions one way or the other. And those also oftentimes directly pertain to the reps and warranties that you're going to make at the purchase agreement. So step one, let's talk about where we currently stand from a compliance perspective to begin with. Fix what we can fix so that we can conform with some of those gaps in the reps that you may not be able to tailor exactly the way that you want to tailor them. And then once you've taken all the remediation and sales preparatory processes to step into that sales cycle, if you will, for the company, then you're better equipped and you're better positioned to start to negotiate those representations as you move closer to closing. Is that fair, Kate?
I think that's exactly right. And I think, the whole thing is these reps and warranties are material. So if you don't really know and you're representing the truthfulness of this, it's a material misrepresent, a fraud. And that
which is another representation that we would definitely want to take advantage of on the buy side or the sell side, is that 10b6 rep. But I mean, that's probably a little bit farther into the weeds when we want to go at this point.
No, but that's a good point, and it speaks to perhaps maybe we should just jump right into this here, since we're already running up, getting close to the end of the hour here that we have. So what happens post closing when we have representations that have been made and perhaps in error, or there are other issues that need to be remediated post closing? And so when it happens, if we've gotten our wires crossed here, not to get a technology metaphor here, but issues happen in M&A, regardless of whether there's data privacy, technology, and cybersecurity issues there as well. And so when there's a whole nother level, however, when there's data privacy involved, because it's not just the two parties, but there's the data subjects, as Kate has mentioned earlier, and the regulators as well. And so I would be interested to hear the panel's thoughts. I will just open this up to whomever wants to jump in and add off of that. I love the robust discussion that we've been having today on these points. So I would be interested to hear the panel's thoughts on remediation considerations when we encounter these issues post-closing.
So could we get to that? But let's put up the slides on the reps and warranties and kind of talk about walk through it to get us there, because I think that would be helpful for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I just want to tell you all, I was reading, the ABA does this deal study pretty much every couple of years. And they were giving some shocking statistic, and I can't remember if it was 60% or 70%, but they were saying only 60 or 70% of deals actually have privacy or cyber reps and warranties. That's a flag, right? Because this is a very big issue. And so if you don't have them, you're definitely wanting to take this, but they gave some samples. So here's the privacy sample, write it down, ABA deal point study, and you can basically see that they're not just talking about the privacy laws, they're talking about contractual obligations, fiduciary obligations. For example, your law firm would have fiduciary obligations regarding its client data. But so there are other sources of duty that you have to consider. And then Kristen, if you could flip a slide forward, then there's going to be a cyber sample. This is again from the ABA thing, but this is just an example. Let's flip to the next one. This is from the real world, and you'll see that it's delineated with certain laws. This would be very broad because it's including without limitation to the extent applicable. It would be better from a sell perspective. Earlier, Michael was talking about the buyer perspective, about getting the broadest possible. From a privacy perspective, you always want to define the laws that apply to your business and that you are being expected to comply with, because without that, you really don't have a proper frame of reference. And I frankly think pretty much everyone is constantly falling short. It's just a matter of, is where you're falling short reasonable? And the answer to that is, if you've done an assessment and there are not critical items listed, you're probably within the reasonable. If there are critical items listed and you're making a good faith effort to remediate them, that's probably reasonable too. But you need to think about all of these kind of reps and warranties. And then, Michael, I want you to talk about disclosures in kind of specifically, because I imagine you're kind of adverse to the idea of disclosing a lot of these things to sidestep the reps and warranties. But that's something that I've seen in the past and had a conversation with M&A lawyers. My concern as a privacy lawyer is when you use disclosures to try to sidestep or carve out reps and warranties, you're admitting a lot. And how that functions in the real world, if you say, we've identified this as a material risk to our business, we're not in compliance with this law, that can be problematic. It may be factual, but that may be problematic from another perspective. Again, it's Wild West. I don't have clear answers about it, but it's something that you've got to think through when you're working through these issues.
Yeah, so Kate, I totally agree. I mean, in deals I've done in the past, you'll have business clients ask, oh, well, how does the purchase agreement look? And we negotiate all the reps and warranties. And the answer is always, well, let's see what they put in schedules, right? Because you can make all these reps. And I've had this on a past deal where we got the purchase agreement back and all the reps were left untouched, except there were about 25 inclusions of except as disclosed in schedule X.Z, except as disclosed. And so it's just like filled with exceptions. It's like, well, these reps and warranties are pointless until I see what you're pointing out these exceptions to. And so I don't know where everyone stands in terms of understanding how the disclosure schedule and representations and warranties work, but everyone may be familiar with this already, but basically the representation is made. I have complied with all laws. Right, that's what you're saying as the sell side company. What you can do is you can qualify that by saying, except as I set forth in this accompanying document, I've complied with all laws. And so and then in that document, you would say, I have not complied with GDPR, I have not complied with the CCPA, I have not complied with the, so you would list all the things that you haven't complied with, so that if the buyer comes to you for a breach of that broad warranty that you have complied with all laws, you can say, no, because I said, except for these issues, I've complied with all laws. And so the disclosure schedule is often a way that sellers sometimes, not all sellers, but sometimes will try to just do a massive data dump into the disclosure schedule to say, hey, I told you everything that you needed to know. It's all in the disclosure schedule, so I didn't breach any of the reps, right? So we typically push back pretty hard on that. And that's why the disclosure schedule, even though sometimes I think it's characterized as a junior responsibility to look at it and edit and review, it's actually super important because it directly impacts the reps themselves that are maybe negotiated by mid-levels or senior associates, or sometimes even the partners get involved. But those disclosure schedules materially impact those. And
I completely agree. Let's advance to the next slide, because I think it's going to be very helpful to the people who are watching. We wanted to talk about ways to reduce risk. And one of the ways is through disclosure schedules and kind of making those carve outs. But we put this together and you can take a picture of it, because I'm not sure we'll have enough time to go through and get to Kristen's question. But if you're a target, there are certain things that you want to think about. If you're a buyer, there are certain things you want to think about. Is there anything that you want to highlight in yours, Michael?
I know we've only got 5 minutes left. I'm trying to decide where to spend the time here. Let me address two things, and then I'll kick it over to Kate and Rachel to close out with any comments, since we're kind of on this topic of disclosure schedules and knowledge and things like that. So one, I want to address a question by Keena Scroth that popped up in the questions, because I think it's relevant here. Are you seeing data privacy representation, specific caps or baskets in M&A identification procedure, or data privacy used as a fundamental representation? The answer to all of those is yes. I can think specifically of a deal that we did recently where, as a technology company, we make intellectual property reps, fundamental reps. And generally what we do is we create a cybersecurity and data privacy representations as a subsection of the intellectual property reps. And so it's a little tricky in the sense that it's not called out that you're calling out data privacy as a fundamental rep, but you're including in a subsection of a rep that's generally included as a fundamental representation of technology deals in intellectual property. And so we do try to capture that as a fundamental rep that generally is treated a little bit more special when you're talking about identification. And And then oftentimes if we see problems or we see risks or issues in data privacy or intellectual property or anything that goes along with that, we will look to, if we don't feel like we've adequately covered it in the representations, or we can't adequately cover it in the reps and warranties, then we will try to insert a special indemnification that's tailored to the specific risks that we've identified. So in addition to the breach of the reps and warranty, there'll be a special indemnity pertaining to whatever the material issue that we've identified that we want to protect for. So that's the one point that I want to address. The second point really quickly is Kate's point about dumping into disclosure schedules. Another way to address that is anti-sandbagging provision, which you can do some research on this to further educate yourself. But the basic concept is that anti-sandbagging basically means the buyer is not going to be precluded from using indemnification provisions as a mechanism for recovery, even if they knew about the breach before closing. So if you did diligence and you knew that the seller was in breach of a representation before closing, doesn't matter. You can still tag them for breach of the reps and warranties and get recovered through the indemnification procedures after the fact. That's a heavily negotiated point. I think the deal point study, it's kind of all over the board, depending on the industry and the deal type and everything else, whether or not buyers or sellers are able to negotiate that point. But it's definitely something that we try to get under every single time, because we don't want to have our indemnification rights limited by the fact that we sort of inkling that something was out there before closing. So I will shut up now and kick it over to Rachel and Kate and Kristen to close it out.
Well, Kristen, coming back to your question, and Rachel, let me just quickly
go ahead.
You said about remediation and things. I'm going to go on another tangent just because we've got to cover it. Rep and warranty insurance has become
that's where I was going.
You take it.
No worries. I just want to mention that's something that you don't see here for reasons Kate and I'm sure are both eager to talk about. So while it's very popular risk management tool, what it can't do for you is protect against something that so something that's in the disclosure schedules. And it also wouldn't cover something that was discovered between signing and closing. So, the Yahoo and Verizon deal, I'm sure there was not rep and warranty insurance on that deal, but an issue like that is not something that would have been covered. You'd also, if you're going the rep and warranty insurance route, want to review the policy really carefully for any exclusions, because coverage for data privacy could be contingent on, the target company's underlying cyber insurance policy and could be limited to the scope of that insurance. And certain fines, like regulatory fines, could be completely excluded. So it's certainly not a get out of jail free card for your data security risks. Go ahead, Kate.
Page, totally on the same page.
Cool.
So.
And that brings us to the top of the hour. I would like to thank Kate, Rachel, and Michael for their expertise, their discussion, and the robust discussion that we had today. Clearly, we could have had a much longer conversation about this, but I am very thankful for the points that we covered in the time that we had. Thank you all for your attendance and your attention during this conversation, and for your questions. It's very helpful in guiding the discussion. As a reminder, the course credit number for self-reporting CLE is available in the Zoom chat. And if you are interested in volunteering or being part of DAYL's Deal Bootcamp Committee next year, please reach out to me or to Sherry after this program. We would love to have you involved. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks,
guys.
Bye-bye.
Right. Take care. Bye.